Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring my art channel. And if you'd like to support my comic and read the new chapter, you can check out my Patreon page in the description below. I'm going to jump straight into the contents of this video, which are going to be a step-by-step explanation of how I go about adding lighting and shadows to my comic pages. So as you can see, I am working on a double-page spread, and I'm basically starting at the step that follows the flatting stage. So the flatting stage is essentially just putting down all the flat colors, and what you get obviously is a pretty flat image. So I am explaining to you each step that I take in order to complete the scene and add all the lighting and shadows. So the first very important step, as you see me doing right now, is simple gradients. So I select one panel at a time, and taking into consideration the lighting in the scene, specifically in this case, as you can see, there's a window, so presumably that will dictate most of where I will be placing the gradients. And this is 50-50 logic and visuals. So what I mean by that is I'm not trying to create the most realistic possible lighting in this particular scene, because I don't really know exactly how to do that, and it will require references, and it doesn't matter too much as long as the impression is created. So sometimes I will make certain decisions that just help the page look a little bit better. So I have some gradients that are more sharp than others, as you probably noticed, and others are mostly soft. And as you saw me do a back and forth just now, you can really see how big of a difference just a simple gradient step makes. And it honestly doesn't take very long, because you just select one panel at a time, and doing a couple of gradients takes like a few seconds. So it's a super valuable first step to me, because it really establishes the direction for going forward with the next steps. So it's basically like the very important baseline for how I'm going to place the rest of the more detailed shadows. So that's the second step, and how I roughly divide these steps is, I guess, by layers. So I'll have the gradients on one layer, so that's one step, and then the next layer will be this second step, which is just detailed lighting, mostly concentrated on the characters, but the background elements as well, as much as necessary. Before I continue, let me tell you about my sponsor, Squarespace. As a full-time professional artist working from home, having a portfolio website is crucial for bringing in new clients. Social media definitely plays a part, but it is not a sufficient replacement for a portfolio website, because having to post frequently can really stand in the way of curating a proper gallery that is a good representation of my work. And so as a solution, I've been using Squarespace for years in order to show my work to potential clients. The galleries are super easy to set up and organize, and it only takes minutes to update when I have something new. This website also serves as a main link hub that is super useful to anybody who is interested in my work, so they can easily find information on how to contact me, view my shop, my comic website, and social media channels that are not the ones they have found me through. So I highly recommend Squarespace if you're looking for a place to host your website. You can get started for free, and when you're ready to launch your brand new website, you can go to squarespace.com/cosmicspectrumart to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to the video. So I went a little bit more detailed on this page, on these two pages, than I think would normally, because it's an introductory page where you meet one of the main characters for the first time, and I just wanted to make these pages just a little bit more impactful than just like any random page that's in the middle of a scene. And for that reason, I spent a little bit more time on this particular step that you're looking at now than I usually would, but regardless, it's all the same, and it is like a similar level of detail anyways. It's not that much more than usual. But yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to highlight was just how often I utilize the lasso tool. In fact, as you can see, that's mostly what I use in order to add these shadows, and the more I do it, the faster and easier the whole process becomes. It's actually kind of mind-blowing to me, because this is one of the biggest differences in process between how I do things now, specifically with adding shadows, and how I used to do it back when I was working on a previous comic project. So previously I would just use a brush to just draw in the shapes of the shadows, and then go in with a blending tool to just blend out certain areas and then kind of enhance that and go over it a couple of more times to just like bring it to where I want it to be. But I found that using the lasso tool is so much more precise and allows for so much more control of each individual shape and how light or dark I want it to be, because I basically use a combination of lasso and gradients. So I don't even use a regular brush almost at all in the step. And selecting a specific shape is something that I think takes a little bit of time to get used to. But after I've been doing it for, decent enough time, including studies as well. I've done a bunch of studies last year, especially just trying to focus on learning how to select the correct shadow shape in order to make the shading process as quick as possible. And I think this was one of the best things for me to do, because I really did learn a lot and I improved a ton when it comes to selecting the right shape. And I don't have a specific method of like what order I select the shapes in, if that makes any sense. I suppose I go from larger shapes to smaller shapes, but not always and not necessarily. But yeah, as you can see, the shapes that I select are pretty big, but because I haven't been doing this for too long, sometimes, like what you're looking at right now, I'm not 100% sure what shape I should be selecting. So it is obviously always a learning process. And with this particular face, I ended up actually going back a couple of times to tweak the shadows on his face, because sometimes it just looks wrong and maybe I can't necessarily figure it out right away. So I decided to let it sit, and then I come back to it and with a fresh set of eyes after finishing a bunch of other panels, and things go better the second time around, is what I typically notice happens. So yeah, at this point I'm getting much more accustomed to this type of process, and it's been going really well. I will say there are some things that I'm learning along the way that I wish I could have applied a little bit earlier, like the way that I handle shading hair, lighter hair specifically. So with Fiona's blonde hair, for example, in this second panel on the second page, I just tested out leaving out the highlight as a negative, essentially. So like instead of adding a highlight on top of the hair afterwards, like is relatively common as far as shading process goes, I decided to instead select shapes around where the highlight would be and add like a lighter gradient to that, just give it a little bit of shadow, and thus like leaving out the highlight instead of adding it on top. And I actually really like the look of that, and it is much faster to do it that way, at least in my opinion it is, or like the way that I do it is. So with that discovery, if I can call it that, I had to go back and essentially repeat that same thing with some previous panels. And so with each page that I tackle, I do end up learning something new. And yeah, one of the biggest things that I have to watch out for when it comes to this step and a couple of subsequent steps is to not go overboard. And that's always the danger. Like, it may sound stupid. Well, maybe it doesn't sound stupid, actually. Well, the reason why I have to watch out not to go overboard is because it is a very enjoyable and fun process. And sometimes it can be very easy to get lost in the weeds and to just keep selecting shapes and keep adding little shadows and more and more and more. And so it can go for quite some time unless you know how to control yourself and how to keep things simple. And so one of the challenges here is to, obviously, like I mentioned, select bigger shapes if possible, and to make do with a less is more type of attitude. So if I can successfully select one shape and do the gradient, I'm just trying to include as much visual information as possible with each selection that I'm picking. And I I think for the most part, I found a relatively decent medium as far as details go, even though I will say maybe I could probably put even less time into this step if possible. But again, I am kind of treating this comic as a really, like, I'm babying this project in a way where I'm just allowing myself to take it to a level of detail and completion that just feels right to me. So I'm not going to sacrifice quality. If I'm starting to feel like I'm sacrificing quality, then I will definitely backtrack and just add as much detail as I think is necessary. So it's a little bit of a delicate process to balance, because on the one hand, I don't want to spend the rest of my life on like one panel, you know what I'm saying? But on the second hand, I don't want to cut corners and be embarrassed of the result. Essentially, that's where I will draw the line. Like, if I look at something and the result is something I wouldn't necessarily want to show people because I don't want my name attached to it, then that's how I know I definitely did not put enough effort into something. And maybe that's a dangerous game to play, but so far so good, because I am almost done with this chapter. Just have a few pages left. And yeah, I'm very thrilled that it's coming to an end, and I'm already in the middle of, like, I've been thinking about chapter 2 a lot. I've reread it a bunch of times, and now my next task for chapter 2 is to essentially find whatever 3D models I need for some new backgrounds that will be reoccurring. But in any case, I'm kind of going off of topic here. And yeah, so as you can see, I'm still on the second step of shadows here, but it is almost done. So there are just a couple of steps after this for the lighting / shadows portion of the comic process production. So the next 2 steps are adding some highlights, which I did end up doing for, I think, most of this comic. This is actually not a step that I had included often in my previous comic work, but in this one, because it's full color, I find that adding a little bit of lighting and highlights actually adds makes a big difference in the end result. So I started doing that as well, and after that I do a paint over, which is like the final step. So as you can see here, I'm moving on to the highlights portion of the process. And here, I don't remember what layer style I'm using, but sometimes I use different layer styles. I think there's a bunch you can choose from, but typically how I land on the layer style that I want is I will just literally check how all of them look, like whatever options, like dodge, linear dodge, something colorize, whatever, like any one of those. I think I sometimes end up using pin light or something like that. Doesn't matter. So once I land on which layer style I want to use, I just go over every single panel and just add a little bit of highlights here and there. And for the most part, this is just to visually enhance things. And as you can see, when I'm adding the lighting, suddenly the panels that don't have the lighting or the highlights added yet start to look grayed out and a little bit dull. So this is kind of what I'm talking about. It's an enhancement step, adds more depth to the image, adds more color variation in certain parts. And this is where I typically don't do selections when I add these types of highlights, because it's like a whole other layer of work that would add a lot of time if I did this for every single page. But I made an exception for these 2 pages because, like I said earlier, it's an introduction double page spread where one of the main characters appears for the first time. So I was like, okay, whatever, I can go a little bit extra on these pages. And so I did. So, but also, like, you know, I didn't spend too much time on that either. So I kind of found a good balance there, I think. And as soon as I added all the little highlights to every single panel, the final step that I'm moving on to is the paint over. And the paint over is essentially just one layer on top of everything else, where I use a solid brush to mostly add some stray hairs and secondarily some highlights on the skin and to just get rid of whatever little imperfections I happen to notice during the rest of the process. This is definitely one of the steps where I, again, have to really watch out for spending too much time, because in my typical illustration process that is not the comics, I actually spend way more time on this particular paint over step than I would while making a comic, because that is a step where I typically try to polish out very strong edges between line art and shadows. So I try to smooth out transitions and add more volume and more depth to the image. But of course, in a comic, nobody has the time for that, so I have to really pick and choose what I do in this step. And like I mentioned earlier, mostly the biggest impact that you can make is to add some stray hairs, because that will immediately add depth and volume to the drawing. And it sounds pretty straightforward, or it doesn't sound like it would make that much of a difference, but you can really see the visual difference instantly, because it just adds, I don't know, these are the types of details that you really can't account for in the previous steps, because it's only something that you can put on top of everything at the very last step, which is obviously why you do it in the very last step. But I mean, I know maybe that sounds super obvious, but it's something that I didn't start doing until fairly later on into my general drawing journey, my illustration journey. It's something that I found was super impactful near the end of the process. And anyways, I digress. So again, one of the other tiny little things that adds a big difference, of course, is adding the highlight to the eyes. It really kind of helps liven up the characters. Pretty important stuff. Most people don't forget it. I know it's something that everyone does, but I figure I'd just mention it anyways. And lastly, I will sometimes add a little bit of rim lighting or little highlights here and there, but I did that especially a lot when I was working on Grimoire Noir. But so far in this comic, I just didn't want to, like I said, spend way too much time, so I was more selective. I didn't choose to add any extra highlights to the curtains, which I could have, but I figured that would be totally redundant, and so I did not. So that was the gist of how I go from flats to the very final step. So I guess we've come full circle to my entire process for creating a comic page, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was more concise than usual. I didn't want to spend too long in this video, but here it is. Hope you learned something, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!